The humidity of the Georgia lowlands hung like a wet shroud over the hunters, a thick and suffocating vapor that smelled of stagnant water and decaying peat. Silas, a man whose soul had been calloused by years of human trafficking, wiped the grime from his brow with a hand that shook more from greed than from the heat. Beside him, Miller let out a jagged laugh, the sound grating against the unnatural stillness of the ancient cypress trees that loomed like skeletal giants above them. They had spent 3 grueling days tracking their prize through the Blackwater miasmas, driven by the frantic pulse of a high-stakes bounty that promised a winter of luxury. To them, the man bound in heavy, rusted irons at the center of their camp was not a human being with a history or a heart, but a walking ledger of silver coins. They sat by a sputtering fire, their faces twisted into sneers of perceived victory, completely oblivious to the fact that the wilderness was beginning to draw a tight, suffocating circle around their hubris. Miller leaned forward, the firelight dancing cruelly in his yellowed eyes as he poked at the captive's ribs with the butt of a heavy, iron-sighted musket. He began a slow, mocking monologue about the natural order, his voice dripping with the poisonous arrogance of a man who believed that the gun in his hand made him a god. The captive remained as motionless as a statue carved from obsidian, his head bowed in a way that the hunters misinterpreted as a sign of a broken and defeated spirit. Silas joined in the taunting, tossing a scrap of gristle toward the man's feet and laughing when it landed in the mud, comparing the man's silent endurance to that of a common beast of burden. They spoke of the auctions to come and the chains that would never leave his limbs, their words intended to humiliate and strip away the last vestiges of his dignity. They were so intoxicated by their own sense of dominance that they failed to notice the captive was not trembling, but breathing in a slow, rhythmic cadence that matched the swaying of the trees. The setting itself seemed to recoil from the hunter's cruelty, the jagged edges of the swamp underbrush tearing at their clothes like warning claws that they refused to heed. This was an unforgiving landscape, a place where the line between the living and the dead was as thin as a dragonfly's wing, yet the hunters treated it like a personal playground for their malice. They bragged loudly about their previous catches, recounting stories of terror and submission as if they were reciting a heroic epic, their voices echoing hollowly off the Spanish moss that draped from the branches. The swamp was a labyrinth of sinkholes and hidden predators, a terrain that demanded respect and silence, yet these men filled the air with the cacophony of their own inflated egos. They viewed the mud and the thorns as mere inconveniences on their path to a payday, never imagining that the environment was actively conspiring with the man they held in chains. Every boastful shout was a flare sent into the darkness, signaling their exact location to a forest that was no longer neutral in this hunt. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple across the canopy, the mocking tone of the hunters took on a frantic, desperate edge. Silas began to recount the sport of the hunt, laughing about how easy it had been to corner a man who seemed so large and formidable, yet surrendered so quietly. He didn't realize that the silence of their prisoner was not the silence of the grave, but the silence of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to spring its trap. The iron collars they had tightened around the man's neck were intended to be symbols of their absolute control. Yet in the encroaching gloom, the metal seemed to glow with a strange, cold light. They mocked his savagery while exhibiting a brutality that was far more primitive, unaware that their target was watching the way the shadows moved behind them with a keen, predatory intelligence. The hunters were the architects of their own doom, building a monument of arrogance that was about to collapse under the weight of a reality they were too blinded by prejudice to see. In these final moments of daylight, the hubris of the hunt reached its absolute zenith, a fever pitch of cruelty that signaled the end of the hunter's reign of terror. Miller stood up to kick the dirt toward the captive, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the camp, looking more like a monster than the man he sought to dehumanize. He made a joke about the man's silence, asking if he had forgotten the language of men, never dreaming that the captive was listening to a much older language spoken by the wind and the reeds. The hunters felt a surge of pride as they looked at the heavy locks and the sturdy ropes, believing that iron and hemp were enough to bind a soul that had already been claimed by the spirits of the woods. They were the masters of their small, fire-lit world, or so they told themselves as they took one last swig of whiskey to toast their supposed brilliance. Little did they know that the prey had finished his preparations, and that the first crack of a twig in the darkness was not an animal but the sound of the world turning against them. As the final embers of the sun perished behind the tangled horizon, a subtle and chilling transformation began to ripple through the captive's once placid frame. The heavy slump of his shoulders vanished, replaced by a rigid, coiled tension that suggested a spring compressed to its absolute limit, waiting for the slightest friction to trigger a release. Silas noticed the shift first, pausing mid-sentence as he saw the captive lift his head, his eyes no longer dull with exhaustion, but burning with a terrifying, lucent clarity. The fear they had spent hours mocking was gone, replaced by a cold, mathematical gaze that seemed to weigh the hunters' souls and find them tragically wanting in the scales of survival. He wasn't looking at the men as masters, but as obstacles, his pupils dilating to drink in every flicker of movement in the encroaching velvet blackness of the swamp. The air around the campfire seemed to thicken, turning heavy with a premonition of violence that made the hair on the hunters' necks stand up in instinctive, primal warning. Miller tried to break the sudden tension with a forced, rattling cough, but the sound was swallowed instantly by a silence so absolute it felt physical. He looked at the prisoner and realized the man was no longer listening to their insults, but was instead tilting his ear toward the deep, rhythmic pulse of the wilderness. Suddenly, a low, melodic whistle drifted through the cypress knees, a sound too complex for a bird and too intentional to be the work of the shifting wind. The captive's chest expanded in a deep, slow breath, and his throat moved as if he were vibrating a silent answer back into the throat of the night. It was a call and response that bypassed the hunters entirely, a secret language spoken in the frequencies of the forest that turned their campfire into a tiny, vulnerable island. The arrogance that had fueled their laughter only an hour ago began to evaporate, replaced by the gnawing realization that they were no longer the authors of this specific story. The captive began to hum, a low-frequency drone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the hunter's bones, echoing the strange whistles coming from the dark. This wasn't a song of lamentation or a plea for mercy, but a rhythmic cadence used to synchronize the movements of something vast and hidden just beyond the firelight. Every time Silas moved his hand toward his pistol, the whistling from the woods would shift in pitch, as if the unseen watchers were tracking his every heartbeat with surgical precision. The hunters looked at each other, the bravado draining from their faces as they realized the broken man they had dragged through the mud was actually the conductor of a hidden orchestra. The prisoner's eyes caught the orange glow of the fire, reflecting a predatory fire of his own that made the iron chains around his wrists look like nothing more than temporary ornaments. He was no longer the subject of their cruel sport. He was the focal point of a gathering storm that was about to break over their heads. Miller reached for a fresh log to bolster the dying flames, but his hand froze when a second whistle erupted from the opposite direction, closer and more piercing than the first. The prisoner's smile grew wider, a jagged sliver of white in the darkness that looked less like a human expression and more like a bared blade. He began to sway slightly to the rhythm of the hidden callers, his movements fluid and mocking, showing no sign of the fatigue that should have claimed a man in his position. The hunters realized with a jolt of terror that the prey had been leading them on a specific path for miles, choosing this exact location for its tactical isolation and its proximity to his waiting kin. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted, leaving the men with the guns feeling like children lost in a cathedral of ancient, vengeful gods. They were surrounded by a geography they didn't understand, trapped by a man who had turned his very captivity into a sophisticated and lethal lure for his enemies. As the prisoner finally looked Miller directly in the face, the hunter saw a reflection of his own impending doom written in the calm, steady gaze of the man he had called property. There was no hatred in the captive's expression, only the detached professional coldness of a butcher looking at a herd of cattle that had wandered into the slaughterhouse. The strange whistles from the tree line grew more frequent, overlapping into a complex web of sound that seemed to map out every inch of the campsite with terrifying accuracy. The hunters realized that every mocking word they had uttered had been recorded by the very shadows they now feared, and that the beast they had sought to tame was merely the vanguard of a much larger force. The unseen shift was complete, the transition from master to victim finalized in the click of a tongue and the answering snap of a twig in the blackness. The night was no longer a veil for their crimes, but a shroud being meticulously woven for their bodies by the hands of the man they thought they owned. The fire had begun to fail, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced mockingly against the impenetrable wall of the swamp, prompting Silas to bark a command at Miller. Miller, his nerves frayed by the unsettling whistles and the captive's unnerving stare, grumbled as he grabbed an empty wooden bucket to fetch water from the nearby spring. He stepped away from the flickering safety of the camp, his boots squelching in the muck until the golden radius of the firelight could no longer reach his heels. Silas watched his partner disappear into the obsidian maw of the trees, expecting to hear the usual cursing and splashing of a man frustrated by the dark. Instead, a heavy velvet silence fell over the woods, a silence so thick it felt as though the atmosphere itself had been drained of all sound. The captive sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the spot where Miller had vanished. A look of grim anticipation etched into his dark, firelit features. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as Silas paced the small clearing, his hand white-knuckled around the cold steel of his rifle while he waited for a signal. He called out Miller's name, his voice cracking and sounding small against the vast, ancient indifference of the Georgia wilderness, but no vocal answer returned from the gloom. The only response was the distant, mournful cry of a loon and the rhythmic dripping of water from the Spanish moss, which sounded like a slow-ticking clock counting down. Silas felt a cold sweat break across his skin, a primal realization dawning on him that the boundary between the hunter and the hunted had been irrevocably breached. He ventured a few steps toward the tree line, his lantern swinging wildly and casting distorted, frightening shapes that seemed to leap out from behind every rotted stump. The captive let out a low, guttural chuckle that sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated terror straight through Silas's chest, signaling that the first movement had been played. Driven by a mixture of desperation and fading bravado, Silas lunged into the brush, his lantern light cutting a jagged path through the swirling mist until it landed on something bright. There, lying in the mud near the edge of the Blackwater Spring, was Miller's lantern, its glass shattered, and the flame long since extinguished by the damp earth. The bucket sat nearby, overturned and empty, but of Miller himself, there was no sign of a struggle or a frantic flight across the treacherous terrain. Silas knelt down, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and noticed a dark, viscous trail of blood that didn't lead deeper into the woods or toward the water. Instead, the crimson droplets led directly to the base of a massive, gnarled oak tree and abruptly stopped, as if the man had simply evaporated. He looked down at the mud, searching for footprints, but found only the deep, heavy indentations of Miller's boots, ending in a pair of frantic, sliding scuffs. A sudden, wet thud echoed from the canopy above, and Silas slowly tilted his head upward, his lantern light trembling as it climbed the moss-covered trunk of the great oak. High above, tangled in the high branches where no man should be able to climb in total darkness, he saw a glimpse of a tattered coat. Miller's body was suspended in the air, held aloft by unseen hands, or perhaps by the very vines that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There was no movement from his partner, only the slow, rhythmic swing of a dead weight and the sound of blood pattering onto the broad leaves below. The horror of the sight stripped Silas of his senses, making him realize that the enemy was not just on the ground, but in the air. The captive back at the camp began to sing a low, vibrating melody that seemed to coordinate the movements of the shadows hiding in the leaves. Silas backed away, his boots catching on exposed roots as he scrambled to return to the meager protection of the dying campfire. But the camp now felt like a cage. He looked at the prisoner who was now standing, the heavy iron chains dangling from his wrists as if they were nothing more than jewelry for a king. The captive's eyes were locked onto Silas's, reflecting the absolute certainty of a man who knew he was the only master left in these cursed woods. Every shadow now looked like a predator, and every rustle of the wind sounded like the reaching fingers of the warriors who had claimed Miller as their first harvest. The realization hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. He was not waiting for his partner to return, but merely waiting for his own turn to disappear. The first vanishing had proved that their weapons were useless against an enemy that moved like smoke and struck with the calculated fury of the reclaimed land. The fire was now a gasping collection of red embers, casting a dim and flickering light that barely reached Silas's trembling boots as he collapsed back into the center of the camp. His mind, once sharpened by the brutal logic of the trade, was now splintering under the weight of an incomprehensible reality that defied every rule of his world. He looked at the captive, expecting to see the cowering remains of a man, but found instead a figure of terrifying composure who seemed to have grown in stature as the night deepened. The air felt thin and cold, vibrating with the silent screams of his missing partner and the heavy, oppressive certainty that he was being watched by 100 invisible eyes. Silas tried to raise his rifle, but his muscles felt like lead, his grip slick with a cold sweat that smelled of iron and the stagnant ancient rot of the swamp. He realized then that his perceived authority had been a fragile delusion, a paper shield that was now disintegrating in the presence of a much older and more potent power. The captive finally broke his silence, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to emerge from the very throat of the earth rather than a man's chest. He spoke not with the desperation of a slave, but with the measured authority of a commander who had successfully orchestrated a flawless and lethal military maneuver. He told Silas that he had never been lost or captured, but had purposely allowed himself to be seen to lead the hunters into this specific, shadowed cathedral of trees. Each word was a hammer blow against Silas's sanity, revealing that every mile they had traveled was a calculated step deeper into a trap designed to erase them. The prisoner explained that the prey was merely a mirror, reflecting the hunters' own cruelty back upon them until they were blinded by the darkness of their own black hearts. Silas felt the foundations of his reality crumble as he realized he was not a victor, but a piece of bait that had served its purpose with pathetic, predictable ease. The psychological weight of the revelation began to crush Silas's spirit, turning his arrogance into a frantic, whimpering terror that made him claw at the dirt like a wounded animal. He looked at the chains lying discarded in the dust and realized they were never broken by force but were simply shed when the time for the masquerade had finally reached its end. The whistles in the dark grew louder, taking on a mocking, melodic quality that seemed to harmonize with the prisoner's calm and terrifyingly eloquent description of the coming dawn. Silas started to hallucinate, seeing Miller's face in every shifting shadow and hearing the rattling of phantom shackles that now seemed to be tightening around his own neck. He was trapped in a kill box of his own making, a geographic and mental prison where the only exit was through a gauntlet of vengeful spirits he had spent his life creating. The man he had mocked was now his only link to a world he would never see again, a god of the grove who held the threads of Silas's life in his scarred, steady hands. As the prisoner stepped into the center of the fading light, he looked down at Silas with a pity that was far more painful and insulting than any physical blow could ever be. He recounted how many men like Silas had entered these woods with iron and hate, only to become the very soil that fed the roots of the trees they sought to conquer. The captive revealed that his tribe had been tracking the hunters since the first day, moving like ghosts through the canopy, waiting for the signal to reclaim what was stolen. Silas realized with a jolt of horror that his entire life had been a prelude to this moment of absolute insignificance, a brief and bloody spark that was about to be snuffed out by the dark. The psychological collapse was total, leaving Silas unable to even form a prayer as he watched the prey rise to his full height against the backdrop of the night. He was no longer a man in his own eyes, but a shivering, discarded husk of a human being, waiting for the final judgment of the shadows he had dared to provoke. In this state of mental ruin, the boundary between the physical world and the nightmare realm of the swamp began to blur until Silas could no longer tell if he was awake. He saw the trees begin to move, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers to touch his shoulders, while the captive's voice continued to weave a tapestry of inevitable doom. The captive told him that the silence he feared was not an absence of sound, but the presence of justice, a heavy and silent weight that was now descending to crush his chest. Every boastful laugh he had ever uttered echoed back to him in the wind, sounding like the dry, hollow rattling of 1,000,000 dead leaves in a winter storm. He was a prisoner of his own history, bound by invisible cords of guilt and terror that were far stronger than any iron collar he had ever forged for another man. As the captive turned away to signal the final assault, Silas stayed rooted to the spot, his mind a shattered vessel, waiting for the darkness to finally finish the work it had started. The final hour of the night arrived with a stillness so profound it felt as though the world had held its breath, waiting for the blood-red dawn to settle the score. The captive stood amidst the dying fire, no longer a prisoner of men, but a titan of the territory, his skin gleaming like polished stone in the faint light of the moon. Silas looked up from the dirt, his eyes wide and vacant, watching as the broken iron shackles were kicked aside like the discarded skin of a serpent that had outgrown its cage. The heavy clink of that metal hitting the stone sounded the final death knell for the hunter's era of dominance, a signal that the old laws of the whip were officially dead. In their place rose a new and terrifying reality where the hunter was now the trophy, and the forest itself was the courtroom where the final sentence would be carried out. The power had shifted completely, leaving the remaining man a shivering wreck of his former self, staring into the face of a justice that knew no mercy for his kind. Suddenly, the shadows at the edge of the clearing solidified into a dozen tall, silent figures who stepped forward with the grace of panthers emerging from the tall grass. These were the warriors the captive had signaled, men who moved with a synchronized, lethal intent that made the hunter's previous efforts look like the clumsy fumbling of children in the dark. They did not shout or gloat. They simply occupied the space with an air of absolute ownership, their eyes reflecting the same ancient fire that burned within the man Silas had mocked. The reversal was visual and visceral as the hunter's weapons were gathered up by hands that actually knew how to use them for survival rather than for the coward's trade. Silas realized that the men he had viewed as property were the architects of a sophisticated trap that had used his own greed as the primary mechanism for his destruction. He was now the one surrounded by a circle of judgment, facing a wall of silent, righteous fury that required no words to communicate the depth of his impending doom. As the prisoner, now the leader, approached the center of the camp, he picked up the very iron collar that Silas had tightened around his neck just 3 days prior. He looked at the cold, rusted metal with a detached curiosity, as if examining a relic from a primitive and barbaric civilization that had finally been wiped from the earth. With a slow, deliberate movement, he dropped the collar in front of Silas, the heavy ring settling into the mud with a finality that felt like a coffin lid being slammed shut. This was the ultimate reversal. The tool of enslavement was now a mirror held up to the face of the man who had lived by the chain and would now be broken by it. Silas tried to crawl away, but his limbs failed him, his body finally succumbing to the crushing weight of the terror he had spent a lifetime inflicting upon others. He was witnessing the birth of a new world, one where the prey had learned to bite back with a ferocity that made the original hunt look like a dream. The first rays of the sun began to pierce through the thick canopy, but they brought no warmth or salvation to the man who lay broken in the center of the clearing. Instead, the light revealed the true scale of the harvest, showing the hunters' supplies scattered and their trail erased as if they had never existed in the first place. The warriors began to move out, melting back into the green heart of the wilderness with the same haunting silence that had characterized their arrival, leaving only the leader behind for one final moment. He stood over Silas, a silhouette of reclaimed dignity and power, looking down at the hunter with a gaze that was neither hateful nor vengeful, but merely finished. He walked away into the shimmering mist of the morning, his footsteps leaving no trace on the land that had already chosen its side in this ancient struggle. The hunters were gone, swallowed by the very shadows they thought they had mastered, leaving only the wind to whisper the story of the day the prey became the predator. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the campsite was nothing more than a patch of disturbed earth, rapidly being reclaimed by the aggressive growth of the vines and the ferns. There were no markers to indicate that two men had lost their lives, or that a third had found his freedom. For the swamp has a way of digesting both sin and glory with equal indifference. The iron shackles would eventually sink into the muck, turning to rust and red earth, becoming a part of the soil that would feed the trees for generations to come. Somewhere deep in the interior, a new song was being sung, a melody of liberation that echoed off the water and carried the message of a hunt that had gone terribly wrong for the wicked. The story of the slave hunters would be told in hushed tones as a warning to those who think they can own another soul without paying the ultimate price to the earth. The forest remained a sanctuary for those who respected its power, while it served as a nameless grave for the men who mistook their chains for a crown. History isn't just about what happened. It's about the secrets that were meant to stay buried in the dark. If you crave the stories the textbooks are too afraid to tell, join our circle. Subscribe to Strange History and never miss a descent into the past. The shadows are waiting.